This is Elias Canetti from his Nobel Prize winning work, Crowds and Power, and he's talking about slavery. And the idea about slavery is that it was a sort of ritual form of forced labor, and it kind of has been pretty much since time immemorial that people have had slaves. Now, I mean, I think there is slavery still in the world. There's certainly various forms of labor, slavery, sweatshop labor, perhaps, certainly sex slavery, that kind of stuff, where people are objectified and made to do things repetitively uh, either for money or for various coercive reasons that they're forced to do it. But then there's this secondary metaphor of slavery, like we could be enslaved to an addiction, or perhaps when we forego control, in a sense, we are slaves. A slave is not merely a thing which is owned, but what, according to Canetti? He asserts a thing is essentially impenetrable. It can be pushed or pulled about, but it cannot receive or store up commands. A slave may legally be accounted a thing which is owned, but this is misleading. A slave is an animal which is owned. And like the important distinction here is that, most of us, like if you were to think of a slave as a kind of animal property, right? Most of us take pretty decent care of our animals. Now, this is certainly not always the case, but you would think of the slave as, say, like a horse or something, right? Which would also be engaged in some kind of labor, or like you could even think of it as an inanimate object, although it's different than Canetti's metaphor of like an automobile or something. Like you wouldn't willingly go out of your way to harm your horse, right? Although you could kick it and mistreat it and beat it and do bad things. That is true. A single slave can best be compared to what? Canetti asserts a single slave can best be compared to a domesticated dog, right? And then he continues. He says, the dog has been detached from its pack. It is isolated and under the orders of its master. When his own pursuits conflict with these orders, it is made to give them up, in return for which it is fed by its master. In its play, the child practices what? When the child masters transformations, it is promoted to what? And I think, here's where this gets very interesting, because he really spends a lot of time on this idea of the metamorphosis, or the transition, or the transformation. So check this out. For both the slave and the dog, commands and food come from the same source, and in this they resemble a young child. Where they are essentially different from a child is in relation to its transformations. In its play, the child practices all the transformations it may be able to use later, and its parents help it with these and continually encourage it to acquire fresh ones. It continues to grow in many different ways, and when it has mastered its transformations, it is rewarded by being promoted to adult status. And so this idea of, play and reality for the child, that it kind of it sort of forecasts these transformations and metamorphoses, and then through the ongoing struggle with life, it masters, right? I mean, we do we so what happens, right? So eventually the child graduates from the 8th grade, goes to high school, and then there are other things, gets his driver's license, graduates high school. There are all these changes and transformations into adulthood. Eventually graduate college, get married, have a job, right? Well, here's the rub. For the slave, all of these transformations or metamorphoses are withdrawn as possibilities. The slave has to do the same thing over and over again. And so here's the next slide. What does the slave's master put out of reach? Just as its master does not allow a dog to chase whatever it wants, but confines its hunting to his own needs or wishes, so the slave's master puts out of his reach one metamorphosis after another. The slave must not do this and must not do that, but some things he must do over and over again. And the simpler and more limited these are, the more likely his master is to require them of him. How does Canetti refer to someone who is restricted to one operation only, in addition, is expected to get as much as possible done in the shortest possible time? That is, to be productive. And here's the kind of metaphorical notion of slavery that, like you could be a slave to your labors, or you could be a slave to consumption, or if you have any particular addiction or something like that where you lose control, you are enslaved. So this is what Canetti says. He says, differentiation of functions need not damage the balance of transformation in a man as long as he is still allowed to carry out a variety of operations. But as soon as he is restricted to one operation only, and in addition is expected to get as much as possible done in the shortest possible time, that is, to be productive, he becomes what we cannot help describing as a slave.